So we're now recording, everyone, and I'm going to share my screen with you, and hopefully you should be able to see some slides. So today's presentation is You, Me and Disability, but essentially it's about how you can be a better disability ally for all the disabled people out there. So as I said, I'm going to touch on what disability is, the issues that disabled people face, and then we'll move on to the tips on how you can be a better disability ally. A question that I ask quite a lot is, what is disability? And I think a lot of people out there have very definite ideas and opinions about what disability is, and this kind of falls in both categories of non-disabled people and disabled people. I've had many interesting conversations with disabled people about how they wish to identify and I guess label or not label their impairment or condition. So for me, I identify as a disabled person, and you'll understand that that reason why a little bit further into the presentation. But what I do say is, when it comes to what disability is, I think the best option, especially for non-disabled people, is that you let the disabled person lead on their definition of what disability is and how they identify. Another interesting thing that comes out when I do ask non-disabled people this question of what they think disability is that they will tell me that, well, I'm not sure, and actually I don't know anyone with a disability. Or the other option is, I'm not sure, but my grandmother has dementia, or my uncle has a prosthetic leg, or the lady down the street uses crutches. They might know one individual, one person who has a disability, and they frame their understanding of disability around that individual's experience or their perception of that individual's experience. And it's not always going to be correct or anything like that. But I think what will surprise you is actually the amount of disabled people that you probably encounter every single day in your life without potentially even realizing that you are doing this. So another question I often ask, and I've asked this in this workshop that I've run in schools before, and the responses that I've had from students has been really interesting. But this question of how many people globally do you think have a disability? I'm not asking you to answer this necessarily, but I just want you to think about for a moment how many people you think might have a disability globally. And the actual number might surprise you. So, there we go. So 15% of, hang on, let me just see, something's flashing at me. Okay, I think we're okay. I hope you can all still see me and hear me and see the slides. It might surprise you to know that 15% of the global population, so an estimated 1 billion people, have a disability of some kind. And this report was taken from 2011, but when I've looked at more recent data, what I have found is that it's still pretty much on par with this statistic. So there are approximately 15% or 1 billion people of the global population living with a disability. And to put that kind of into context with children, obviously, as the screen says, 1 in 20 children globally have a disability. What I want you to do with this is to think about your own context. So you know, your own village, your own town, your own community, and even your own school, and kind of lay these statistics over that context for yourself. And it might give you a little bit more of an idea of actually how many people you might know who have a disability of some kind. The reason that I kind of get people to place this in their own context is that it helps you kind of understand the reason why being a disability ally is so important. Even if you believe and you think that you don't know anyone with a disability, it is so important that you do work on being a better disability ally, because the odds are you have met disabled people before, or you will in the future. It's kind of inevitable. Okay, let's see if the slide will move. Yes. Now, as I mentioned, a lot of people might frame their experience of disability from a very specific individuals, or their perception of a very specific individuals, but disability a lot of the time is seen on a very shallow level, and it's seen very much from a physical disability perspective. So the best example I can give is when I ask people the question of what they think para stands for in Paralympics, and if I got £1 for every time someone answered with, does it mean paraplegic, or does it mean paralyzed, I would probably be a really rich person right now. Because people frame the idea of disability a lot of the time, especially from the idea of a paraplegic or an amputee or something like that, very much a physical disability. And I will tell you actually what para does stand for in the Paralympics is parallel. And the reason it's called parallel Olympics is because it literally runs parallel to the actual, the first Olympic Games, like kind of runs 2 weeks after. So to really understand disability and the issues that disabled people face, and then kind of leading on to that being a better disability ally, you have to try and understand the broadness of disability and the depth of disability. I could probably talk for hours about kind of this list that you have in front of you, but I really don't have the time. So I'm just going to touch very lightly on them, and it's just to give you an idea and a framework within which you can go and investigate further and educate yourself further about these different types of disabilities. So physical disability, I've already mentioned a few. I fall under that category of having a physical disability. There's invisible disability, which quite often can overlap with, oh, Emma's just telling me to let her into the Zoom. So I'm just going to stop sharing the screen for a moment. Let me see. Okay, let me see. There we go. I will put the screen back on. Hopefully Emma is in the space now. Yay! Hi, Emma. Oops, hang on. Let me just see if I can get rid of the participant screen again, and then I'll hit play again. Okay, there we go. Hi, Emma. So invisible disability quite often can overlap with chronic illness as well. So I have a few friends who would identify as having a chronic illness, but are now starting to identify as having an invisible disability. So it's kind of, again, letting the disabled person lead in how they want to identify, but an invisible disability crossing over with chronic illness could include someone who has chronic fatigue. One of my really good friends has rheumatoid arthritis. So there's kind of, these conditions that might not be immediately visible to us, but that individual does have a chronic illness or invisible disability of some kind. Cognitive disability is essentially a learning disability. So you're thinking of people who might have Down syndrome, or any other number of learning disabilities that are out there. But that is separate to neurodivergent, which is people who have autism, who are dyspraxic or dyslexic, and stuff like that. I think there's definitely become more of this line and understanding that it's not actually falling under cognitive disability. It does have its own kind of space. Visual impairment, which again can lead to or can range from minor visual impairment through to blindness. Hearing impairment, similar thing. Partial hearing impairment right through to deafness. Chronic illness we've covered. And one that is a little bit contentious, I know there's a lot of discussion about how mental health sits under the disability umbrella. Some people with mental health issues do want to identify as disabled, others don't. Again, my tip to you is to just let the individual lead on that. So, the medical model of disability historically has been the prevailing understanding of what disability is. And the best way that I can explain that is where the, I don't like using the term blame or fault kind of, or though that's the way kind of society sees that, is that the blame or the problem, as it says on the slide, is kind of on the body of the individual. So the medical model of disability would say that my limb difference is what makes me disabled. The easiest example I can think of is, imagine a big building with the entrance at the top of some stairs, and if you have someone in a wheelchair at the bottom of those stairs, what the medical model of disability would say is that it is the individual in the wheelchair's impairment that is preventing them from accessing that building. So this is becoming more and more an outdated model of what disability is, even though it is still the prevailing idea of what disability is. But a lot of disability activists like myself are really fighting against this particular model of disability. The kind of newer understanding or model of disability is called the social model. And what this model does is that it places the barriers of the impairment and condition that the individual has onto society. So coming back to that building with the stairs and the person in the wheelchair at the bottom who can't access that building because they're in a wheelchair, if the owners of that building simply put a ramp in, you are eliminating that disability for that individual. So because you are allowing them access to that building, you are giving them access to that building, I should say. But it's not just about the physical access as well. I think what is wonderful about the social model of disability is that it also addresses the barriers that attitudes and stereotypes and negative narratives can have towards disabled people. So kind of beliefs that are out there about the disabled experience that are just really unhelpful and untrue. Again, I could talk about this for a very long time, but I don't have the time to do that. For me, when I think about the issues of disability, I think about this idea. I might have someone else who's trying to come in to, let me see. I'm just going to check everyone. If there is someone else waiting to come in. Yes, I'm just going to admit 3 more people. There we go. Okay. Okay. So welcome to the newbies. Sorry you've missed part of the presentation, but I'm going to crack on as I'm keeping an eye on the time. So when I talk about issues with that disabled people have, I generally put it within the context of ableism. Now, it's pretty self-explanatory on this slide that ableism is a form of discrimination. And when a lot of people get confused about ableism or aren't aware of it or understand what it means, I say to them, think of all the isms and phobias that we have out there. So, you know, we've got racism, sexism, homophobia, classism, all of these things that are essentially a language within which we can talk about the discrimination that different people with protected characteristics face. Ableism is essentially the context and the language that we can talk about the discrimination that disabled people face. And essentially any issues that disabled people face will fall under this idea of discrimination and ableism. And the way that this can be expressed is in the list that I have there below, which is around inaccessibility, which we've touched on, infantilization, which is treating disabled people as a child, or obviously specifically adult disabled people as children. I wrote an article a few months ago about this, and one of the lines in there that I wrote was essentially, and this might not be appropriate for some of you in working in schools to share and say to children, but essentially one of the lines I wrote was that disabled people, like adults, drink, swear, go out clubbing, have sex, get married, have children. We do all of these things that is part of being or having a full adult life. And so infantilization kind of takes that away from a disabled individual, which is very patronizing and hurtful to do. Exclusion can be caused by physical barriers or attitudinal barriers. Bullying is pretty self-explanatory. Lack of employment, the gap between the employment rate for non-disabled people and disabled people is huge, and it's why quite a lot of disabled people end up self-employed or stuck on benefits. It's kind of those negative beliefs and stereotypes that kind of create these barriers for disabled people to gain employment. Lack of governmental and social support, which is a really important thing, because what a lot of people I think fail to recognize is that having a disability means that life in general costs a lot more. For me, I certainly wouldn't be able to survive without having the additional support that I get through government to enable me to do the work that I do and to live my life as equally as I possibly can as non-disabled people out there. And physical, domestic and sexual abuse, unfortunately, is a lot higher for disabled people than non-disabled people. So we're going to move on to the allyship section of the presentation. So I really hope that you get some good ideas out of this bit, and we'll go away and think about how you can implement some of them for yourself as an individual as well as within your school. I'm first going to just briefly address what an ally is, and then I'll move on to how you as an individual can be a better ally for disabled people, and then also how your school can be. So there is this brilliant website called Guide to Allyship, and they really cover the idea and understanding of what it is to be an ally. And this was kind of off their website. And for me, I think all of these points in terms of allyship and being a good ally is really important to keep in mind. But for me as a disabled person, two that really particularly stood out to me was the acknowledging that even though you feel pain, the conversation is not about you, and also be willing to own your mistakes and decenter yourself. And the reason these two kind of really stuck out to me was kind of linking back into that idea of ableism and infantilization, and not letting the disabled person lead on their own life and their own understanding about their condition and impairment. So it's about taking yourself and your preconceived ideas of what an experience is and really listening and understanding from the disabled person's perspective, which kind of taps into some of the tips I'm going to share with you right now. So things you can do to be a good disability ally as an individual. First off, as I've mentioned briefly before, is listen to disabled people. And when I say listen to disabled people, it's about hearing their stories and believing what they are telling you. The amounts of times that and I know quite a few other disabled people that have similar experiences, but the amount of times where I have told a story about someone doing something for me or saying something to me which made me feel uncomfortable or made me feel patronized or upset or hurt. And then I'm relaying this story to another non-disabled person who then says to me, oh, but maybe they were just being kind, or they just wanted to be helpful, or something like that. And it's like, well, no, that's not going to work for me, because you know, that person has gone away thinking that they've done or said a good thing, when in actual fact, I feel really upset and hurt. And why should that be the case? That's not really fair to me. The best example I can give, and again, I have written about this before, is the guy who followed me out to a car park once, and I was really scared and really concerned about this guy, that he was following me. And he went to his car and he got out a doormat and came and gave me the doormat and told me he felt sorry for me because I had a disability. And so I'm left there standing holding this doormat. Now, this gentleman thought that he'd done something really kind, no doubt about that. But for me, I was confused, upset, hurt, felt patronized, felt really angry, and I'm stuck with this doormat that I have no idea what to do with. So it's kind of just being aware that perhaps what you are saying or doing isn't the right way to do it, and it's about listening to that disabled person and believing when they tell you these things that are happening. promote disabled people's voices. This is a really important one. And if you don't follow me on Twitter, please do. But do go check out my Twitter account. You don't have to follow me if you don't want to, but go check out my Twitter account and you can check out my follower or who I follow, and you'll see quite a substantial list of disabled people, activists, consultants, and that you can promote their voices and their stories and stuff like that. I think it's really important to share their content. I think it's really important that you watch movies that have a kind of realistic representation of disability, and you share these movies, and same with books and stuff like that. Whatever content is out there that's being created by disabled people's voices, please promote that across your social network. Educate yourself about disability. Again, that's what you're doing here by being on this presentation. And again, it kind of fits in with promoting other disabled people's voices and listening to disabled people. But make sure that you perhaps look at the history of disability, and it might help you understand where a lot of our concerns and issues actually stem from. Be conscious of your everyday language. The quickest way I can kind of say how you can manage this is to neutralize the language you use around disability. So a lot of people still say wheelchair bound when they talk about wheelchair users, but I've just said what you should be saying instead, and that is wheelchair user. So it's about not placing a negative connotation on the language around disability. It's about just neutralizing that so that it is a fact, because it is simply a fact that I have limb difference and I wear a prosthetic leg. I'm not overcoming it. I'm not kind of bound or struggling with the prosthetic leg. It's just pure fact that that is my situation. Speak up when you see accessibility issues. So if you're in your village or your town and you see a space that is inaccessible, and this is important whether you are with a disabled individual or you are not. So even if you're not with a disabled individual, speak up when you see the accessibility issues, because you never know, the next person coming into that shop or that restaurant or that space behind you could have a disability and may struggle to enter. So it's best to speak up when you notice it. Speak up when you see bullying. Self-explanatory. Encourage inclusion. Again, this is about not making assumptions about a person's disability and thinking they can't participate in an event because of their condition or impairment. Just talk to that individual and come up with solutions. So you're encouraging people to be a part of the wider community. And avoid the inspiration trap. I would suggest that you look up this a disability activist. Sadly, she's not with us anymore, but look up Stella Young's TEDx talk, and she talks about something called inspiration porn. Because I work so much in schools, I'm a little bit tentative to use the word porn in schools. So I've come up with this idea of the inspiration trap. The best way I can describe this, and Stella Young does describe and explain it a lot better than I could, but it's, you know, those videos that you share where a disabled individual might get out of a wheelchair and walk, or the baby who's getting the cochlear implant and the mother cries because her baby can hear her and stuff like that. These videos are shared to inspire and make non-disabled people feel really good about themselves, okay? But it doesn't necessarily make disabled people feel good about themselves. So try and avoid falling into that inspiration trap. And, you know, it's just something that you'll see a few of these kind of fold over onto the next list. Okay, things you can do to make your school a good disability ally. Again, promote disabled people's voices in your school by inviting disabled speakers. But I'm just not meaning myself. I'm meaning there are a lot of disabled speakers out there who I think you would really benefit from having coming into your school and visiting with your students and pupils. Provide books by disabled writers into your library, and make sure that you use disabled people's perspectives in the curriculum, which leads me on to the second point, which is educate your pupil students about disability by framing it within the curriculum. So for example, when you talk about the suffragettes, there are a number of suffragettes who had disabilities of some kind. And it's worth, say, in a history class or something like that, where you're talking about the suffragettes, make sure that you include that disability perspective in there as well. And obviously replicate that idea of curriculum framework across your school. Again, be conscious of your everyday language about disability. As we know, children are sponges. They will absorb what they are hearing adults and the way that adults are talking about certain experiences. So do be aware of your language around disability in the classroom. In PSHE, make sure that you have sessions on disability awareness and allyship. But kind of jumping down to the bottom of that list, make sure that these PSHE lessons are really primarily focused to your non-disabled students, because they are the ones that have to learn about how to be a better disability ally. Your SEND pupils, they know what it's like to be disabled. They understand what is needed to be a disability ally. It's your non-disabled pupils and students that need to understand this. Again, as a school, encourage inclusion and actively work with parents and disabled young people to ensure that disabled students feel included. I say parents because there'll obviously be some disabled young people that will need that extra support and guidance from their parents. But if the disabled young person is able to discuss what they need and how to feel more included in their school, and they can discuss this with you, do talk to them primarily about that. I love this one. I wish we had it at my school. Introduce sign language as a language option in your school. It starts to normalize one aspect of disability for people. Plus, it's really cool. Sign language is awesome. And if you as a teacher have a disability, please be as open about it as you can be. I've almost finished developing a disability awareness pack called What is Disability? And a deputy head teacher is actually participating. She's contributed her story to it for me, and she has dyslexia, and she actually shares this openly with her students, and what she's found is that this creates a stronger bond and a higher level of trust between her and her students. So I think if you can share your experiences with disability of students, that's really, really important. So I'm going to quickly move on to questions because we don't have much time left. So while I'm kind of wrapping up, I'll just put my last slide up. I am a speaker and a workshop lead. I can run this workshop or variations of it, or go more in depth on certain points for you if you are interested in booking me to come and speak at your school. Obviously, we can do it virtually at this time being. And also on this slide is my email, my website, and my social media. So I'm going to just click off the screen and stop sharing and come back on and see if there are any questions. So do feel free to pop any questions into the chat. I'm pretty much an open book when it comes to disability. I will answer anything. So, oh, thanks, Yolanda, that's fine. Thanks, Emma. I know all these people are rushing off to watch other sessions, which I'm going to definitely try and catch up on once they're kind of up on the screen, because hopefully a lot of people have recorded them. So, oh, Zena, that's brilliant. I'm so glad that you tell your students about your dyslexia. I think it is so important. And this deputy head teacher who contributed, she is you know, her description of what she did and how it's impacted her life has been absolutely amazing. Okay, Hannah. I know kind of that data where I kind of got that from, it does look like it's out of date, but when I looked the other week at more recent data, it does seem to be kind of still at a similar level. I think there's slightly more disabled people globally, but oh, hi Jacqueline. Okay, I'll share my screen again while I'm still talking about Hannah's question. Okay, hopefully you can see that. I'll go into play mode so you can see it as clear as possible. Yeah, Hannah, I think it's about we have to collaborate and work together to take the lead. And I really hope that when it comes to disability awareness and understanding about the barriers, is that it has to come from people who have that lived experience. I think that is so important. Because essentially it can be quite patronizing when you kind of have non-disabled people who maybe think they're being helpful, but it's kind of not. And I think as well, it's about understanding, and this is what I would really like to see from the disability community, is that we all come together to support each other. I think even if we have very different disabilities, it's important that we are allies. So say for me, as someone with a physical disability is a really good ally to someone with an invisible disability, or someone who is deaf, or someone who is blind, or someone who has autism. It's important that we're all really good allies for each other and supporting each other as well. And I think that is how we have to try and take the lead in helping non-disabled people understand. Okay, are there any more questions? We've still got a couple of more minutes left. Any schools that create a good allyship environment, it's tough. I'll be really honest with you. I haven't come across many schools that that do kind of really stand from that standpoint of disability allyship. I've been into many schools that they have the accessibility down pat, so they've got it, so they've got lifts, it's amazing, it's brilliant, but a lot of the time it might be the attitudes that are creating barriers that they maybe haven't addressed and stuff like that. Just before lockdown, I spoke at a school in Walsall where I did a variation on this this presentation to 13, 14-year-old boys, which are honestly, I think, the hardest crowd to present to. And the teacher who booked me, she said that she'd never done anything like this before, but she is very conscious and wanting to bring more about disability awareness into her school, which I think is the starting point. You just need to be one person in your school who can take the lead on that. Yeah, I think again with TAs, it might even be looking at the diversity of your TAs. Do you have a TA who has a disability of some kind who would be willing to share that experience, Edward? Or even having some kind of training or sharing these tips that I've shared with you today with the TAs in your school, and encouraging them to kind of embody them as well. Hannah, when I was at primary, had a relationship with a school. I think it's tough because it's that question where it comes into inclusion and stuff like that. So I think now there is a real push to try and get more inclusion of disabled students in mainstream schools, but then it's looking at how you build the relationships between the SEND pupils in a school and the non-disabled pupils. I think a lot of the time schools can get quite scared about what might happen if they kind of mix the two. And again, it's going to depend on the breadth and depth of disability within a school as well. So you might have some pupils like myself who could be in the mainstream school and not actually have to have any other support than perhaps some physical support, but you may have other students with different types of disabilities that might not be comfortable mixing with non-disabled students. So again, it's just looking at what the needs of that student are. In terms of schools having relationships with each other, I'm actually really not sure about that, Hannah, so I'd have to look into that. Oh my gosh, if I don't answer all these questions, because we might have to stop this in a minute or so, what I will do is I will answer these questions through social media if that's okay with everyone. And also, if you do follow me on Twitter, which is @Esul, and you have any more questions, you can ask me through social media. And if you don't want to do that publicly, just pop me a DM and I can answer the question that way. In terms of any advice on how to work well with families in which someone other than your student has a disability, again, I think it's just having that openness and that willingness to listen, to not just the kind of parents, but also the young person as well. I think we have to remember that young people really want a voice in their schooling experience, in their lived experience. And I think sometimes that can be forgotten. Jacqueline, I might answer your question. I'm going to take this slide down now and stop sharing and pop back on. Jacqueline, I'll quickly answer your question and then I'll let you guys get on to the next session that you're moving on to. How do we balance making disability better understood without making SEN more of a target for bullying when often they fear? Okay, this is where I think where I spoke about how a lot of disability awareness workshops or training that you have in your school has to be focused on non-disabled kids. I kind of find that a lot of the time stuff like this might actually, you know, when I have spoken in schools, I've been told, oh, can you come and speak specifically to the SEND pupils or something like that, when it's actually, no, it's the non-disabled kids that have to develop empathy and an understanding of what disability is. So I think that that is a starting point, is to start building that education into your school and the curriculum. I hope that helps. I might think of something else to answer that with kind of later on, and I can answer that on social media for you. So I'm going to sign off, everyone. Thank you, everyone. I am going to stop the recording.